everyone, welcome to a new episode of Art Travel Cast. Today's episode will be about cursed poets.
I've always been fascinated by the concept of poet maudit. Paul Verlaine gave it a specific framework in his 1884 collection, focusing on the poets like Arthur Rimbaud and Stéphane Mallarmé. These were creators who lived on the margins of society, often struggling with personal demons.
That's right, Verlaine himself called himself Pauvre Lilien, which is an anagram of his name and surname. This shows how much he identified with this movement. His life was full of turbulent events, including the famous incident with Rimbaud, when Verlaine shot him in Brussels.
Rimbaud is an extraordinary figure. His work, although short, had a huge impact on literature. A Season in Hell or Illuminations are works that still inspire today. His decision to abandon poetry at a young age and travel the world adds an aura of mystery to him.
Mallarmé, on the other hand, was a master of symbolism. His quest for pure poetry and experiments with form were revolutionary. His influence on later poets, including Valery, cannot be overestimated.
We cannot forget de Beauvalmont, the only woman in Valéry's collection. Her poetry, full of emotion and melancholy, was pioneering in the context of French romanticism. Her life was not easy either, which is reflected in her work.
It is also worth mentioning Cléon Dubel, often called the last of the cursed poets. His life ended tragically when he committed suicide in 1913, having previously burned his manuscripts. His poetry, although less known, is full of deep reflection and emotions.
Besides France, the concept of poet maudit has found its way into other countries. For example, the American poet Kurt Cobain, who committed suicide, is often compared to Rimbaud. His The Bridge is a monumental work that tries to capture the spirit of America.
In turn, the Italian poet Dino Campana, author of Canti Orfici, spent the last years of his life in a psychiatric hospital. His poetry, full of visions and symbols, is considered one of the most important achievements of Italian literature of the 20th century.
It's interesting how many of these poets were underestimated during their lifetime, and their work gained recognition only after their death. I guess that is one of the characteristics of poet maudit, being misunderstood by their contemporaries.
Exactly, their lives and work often reflected rebellion against social and artistic norms. This is what makes their poetry so authentic and moving.
Contemporary literature also has its cure spots, although times have changed. The need to express rebellion and individualism remains unchanged.
I agree. The legacy of poets Modit lives on, inspiring new generations of artists to find their own path and express themselves without compromise.
That is why the theme of self-destruction, which many of them have, seems so fascinating. Rimbaud, although he abominated poetry, had something of a self-negation in his decision. Hart Crane, on the other hand, was consciously heading towards death. In their case, it was not just about suffering, but about trying to integrate art with faith, life with literature.
And in this sense, they are heirs to the romantic myth of the poet as both prophets and victim. Think of Lautréamont. His language was so intense that it remained misunderstood for decades. And yet he captivated the surrealist almost immediately.
That's true. Lautréamont used poetic form in a radical way. His aesthetics of ugliness was ahead of its time. No one had dared to write in such a manner before. Gratuitously cruel, blasphemous, disturbing. And again, like many other cursed poets, his life ended suddenly in mysterious circumstances.
And paradoxically, his death, just like his poetry, strengthened the myth. In fact, the whole movement of cursed poets is less an organized literary movement and more of an archetype, a marked poet, expelled from the mainstream of culture.
Even Baudelaire, who was not formally included in Valéry's collection, fits perfectly into this image. The flower of evil were judged, censored, and he himself spoke of his body as a corpus abounded by life.
Baudelaire, moreover, not only set the aesthetic tone of decadence, but also showed that beauty can be found in decay, in decline, in the peripheries. His famous doubleness, longing for the sublime and wallowing in the mood, in the essence of being a cursed poet.
It wasn't a beyond, it was existence, and if Valéry or Rimbaud were victims of their own emotions, Baudelaire was the conscious director of his own self-destruction.
I agree. Baudelaire knew what he was doing. He aestheticized illness, addictions, alienation. In that sense, he was the prototype of the modern artist. And his influence does not end with French poetry. Just look at Charles Bukowski or Jim Morrison, who quoted him. All those cursed poets of later eras carried his legacy.
Bukowski is a very interesting case. He was an equally damned poet, although more from the working class than from the ivory tower. A drunkard, a misanthrope, an outsider, and painfully honest. Although his language was much simpler, the emotional neckness with which he wrote was uncompromising as Rimbaud's. And similarly, he was also ignored by the literary community for years.
Because being a cursed poet is not only a matter of style, but also of attitude towards the world. It is a rejection of rules, not only formal ones, but also social and moral ones. Someone like Sylvia Plath also fits his pattern perfectly. Her Ariel is pure energy of destruction, resistance, and suicidal intensity.
Plath and Sexton, both of them shook up Anglo-Saxon poetry. Their confessional poetry was brutal, intimate, drastic. Their femininity was not sentimental, it was angry, physical, exposed. And both of them ended their lives by suicide. Even their deaths are part of the myth of damnation. It was a work that absorbed their existence.
And what do you think about contemporary poets? Is this model still alive? Can someone be a cursed poet today, having Instagram, publishing contracts?
The form has changed, but the content is surprisingly similar. I think of someone like John Berryman. He was one of the border of these two worlds. On the one hand, a university professor, on the other, an alcoholic and a man turned apart. His the dream songs are also almost Rimbaud, like in intensity, although written in a completely different register.
Berman is a great example, and even more so Roberto Bolaño. Although they wrote mostly prose, his spirit was completely poetic. He was poor, sick, and he wrote about the damned poets with such expertise.
That's true. Bolaño created an alternative history of literature, where outsiders are heroes and normativity is a banality. In this sense, the cursed poet doesn't have to live in the gutter today to be curious. It's enough that his sensibility does not fit within the boundaries of aesthetic correctness.
Or that his poetry is not a product, because today's culture very quickly absorbs everything that was once subversive. A cursed poet can only exist as long as he is not domesticated, as long as he does not allow himself to be colonized by the market.
Exactly. Being curious is no longer necessarily an existential drama, but rather a gesture of protest against uniformity. But it's also much more difficult today to be truly curious. One must consciously escape from the system. It's no longer just fate, it's a choice, and not everyone is ready to make it.
And those who undertake it often pay for it with loneliness, anonymity, lack of recognition. Such was W.S. Graham, a Scottish poet for years almost forgotten, living in poverty. And this is the classic pattern of the cursed poet.
And that is why this figure still moves us, because it says something universal about man, about opposition to the world, about the need for truth, about the destructive power of creativity.
These poets, regardless of the era, are a testament to the fact that not everything can be commercialized, that there is still room for madness, for pain, for beauty that hurts.
And it's they who remind us that poetry does not always have to be understandable, popular on conventions. Sometimes it has to be a thorn, and then it has the greatest power. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you for being with us, and see you next week.